23, and I wrote down the page number here. It is page 991. If you want to find it, those words probably be helpful to have in front of you as we go today.
Yes, so that's Matthew 23, 1 to 12 on page 991. Then Jesus said to the crowds and to his disciples, "The teachers of the law and the Pharisees sit in Moses' seat, so you must be careful to do everything they tell you. But do not do what they do, for they do not practice what they preach. They tie up heavy, cumbersome loads and put them on other people's shoulders, but they themselves are not willing to lift a finger to move them. Everything they do is done for people to see. They make their phylacteries wide and the tassels on their garments long. They love the place of honor at banquets and the most important seats in the synagogues. They love to be greeted with respect in the marketplaces and to be called rabbi by others. But you are not to be called rabbi, for you have one teacher, and you are all brothers. And do not call anyone on earth Father, for you have one Father, and he is in heaven. Nor are you to be called instructors, for you have one instructor, the Messiah. The greatest among you will be your servant. For those who exalt themselves will be humbled, and those who humble themselves will be exalted."
And we need to remember going on just before this because it matters for what we're looking at today. So if you were with us last week, I hope you won't just remember how long it is you were likely to wait in A&E before a doctor will finally attend to you, but you will also remember that Jesus is the epic. That is, that Jesus is the one in charge. He's the one in authority. And actually, the whole section we've been working through all the way since Christmas is all about Jesus, all about his authority. It's focused on the last week of his life, and it's bringing up again and again that question of his authority, growing opposition to it. So that's kind of what's in the air as we begin and walk in today's text. Jesus has faced down a series of challengers. Each of them's trying to dispute or undermine his authority. And now, after all of that, he turns to the crowd and he turns to his own disciples, his followers, and he has something important to tell them. And it starts with how to respond to these people who are called the teachers of the law and the Pharisees. Now, who are they? They're key religious leaders in the Jewish faith. They're known for how serious they were about it, how learned. They're known for their mastery of the Jewish scriptures, their careful following of them into every detail. You might hear this word today, Pharisee, and think something negative. You might think, oh, self-righteous person or the like. And it does have that sense in our kind of contemporary culture. But no one would be thinking that back in Jesus' day. You said Pharisee, what would they think? They would think serious. They would think learned. They would think religious, earnest, impressive. Those are the sorts of words they would have thought of. And to start with, it sounds like Jesus is actually on the same wavelength. So he says this thing, they sit in Moses' seat. The teachers of the law and the Pharisees sit in Moses' seat. What does that mean? Well, Moses was this great leader of God's people in the ancient times, famous because he received God's law, God's commandments for his people on those stone tablets. And Moses' seat, well, normally teachers in the Jewish faith would sit on a seat. They would sit rather than stand in this era. Synagogues would have a stone seat at the front for sitting on. So sitting in Moses' seat basically is saying, teaching Moses' law to God's people, holding a place of teaching authority, right? You're the boss man. You're in charge. People should listen to you. So Jesus says, the teachers of the law and the Pharisees, they sit in Moses' seat. And then he goes on to say, so you must be careful to do everything that they tell you. Really, Jesus? That's pretty hard to square with some of the things you said earlier. That's pretty hard to square with the Jesus that we've been following as we've worked through Matthew's gospel. Look at this, for example, how Jesus responds to the same category of people, Pharisees, on religious hand washing back in chapter 15. He says, why do you break the command of God for the sake of your tradition? He says, you nullify the word of God for the sake of your tradition. So could this same Jesus really be saying, oh, you must be careful to do everything these people tell you to, when he flat out rejects doing everything they've told people to there? And this is not the only time Jesus stands against the Pharisees. He stands against their declarations on the Jewish Sabbath in chapter 12, their teaching on divorce in chapter 19. He stands generally against their teaching as a whole in chapter 16. Here he is again. He's speaking to the disciples, be on your guard against the yeast of the Pharisees and the Sadducees. They're clueless disciples. They got no idea what's going on. They're saying this is a bread conversation because he said yeast. But Jesus clarifies, how don't you understand? I'm not talking about bread. Be on your guard against the yeast. They understood. He was telling them to guard against the teaching. Guarding against the teaching of the Pharisees. So how can Jesus really be telling his followers here, in what we've read today, to obey everything these religious authorities teach when he says, be on your guard against their teaching? That makes no sense. So how do you unravel this? And I think it's not easy to see in our English text here. But most commentators agree Jesus is being ironic here. He says, oh, you should definitely do everything they tell you to. They sat down in the chair of authority after all. Of course you should do what they tell you to. But he's about to lay out exactly why they don't belong in that seat, why they've got no right to it, why they shouldn't have the authority that goes with it. Let me picture this for you, okay? Imagine a teacher is late for a lesson, okay? And for a few minutes, the noise level rises and rises. Things are getting seriously chaotic. It descends towards anarchy. Then one of the children slips over, sits in the teacher's chair at the front. Now, should the class learn the spellings they write on the board? Should the class do the homework that child sets just because they're sat in the seat? Well, no, it's not their seat. They've got no such authority. And what is going to happen when the teacher walks back in, do you think? Or imagine the corner office of a big shot CEO. There's the big leather chair. There's the mahogany desk. But he is in the loo and the cleaner is working in the room. Now imagine the cleaner goes and sits in the boss's chair, picks up the phone, starts calling some departments, buy oranges, sell apples. I want us to begin a new project making a rocket to the moon. Should anyone do what they say simply because they're in the chair? No, it's not their seat. They got no such authority. What is going to happen when the boss walks in? Well, that is exactly what we're reading about this morning. Uh-oh, the teacher is here. Uh-oh, the boss is here. Remember the context. This is about Jesus being in charge. That's what's in the air. That's what we've been talking about. Jesus is the epic. Like we said last week, he's the authority. He is the one who is going to make the decisions. He declares, acts, judges, commands. So he's like, get off the chair, Pharisees. The boss is here. He's about to slam these so-called authorities for being total hypocrites, not true followers of God at all. His point isn't, well, despite their hearts being far from God, despite even their lives being far from God, you should learn or even could learn right living from these weasel words. No, his point is they've got no authority. Their hypocritical lives show following them 1 inch would be a terrible mistake. They do not practice what they preach. They do not practice what they preach. They tie up heavy, cumbersome loads and put them on other people's shoulders. That's how Jesus pictures what these fake teachers are doing with their stolen authority. They're tying up heavy loads and putting them on others' shoulders. Again, that makes it clear when he says, do everything they tell you to do. He can't be meaning that literally. He must be being ironic. He's joking because these fakes are telling people to do all manner of stuff that they don't need to. All sorts of tangled and difficult, awkward rules. Do this, don't do that, and always wash your hands. They're tying up heavy burdens where Jesus contrasts himself as he is the one who, his burden is light. He's the exact opposite. And not only are they making up all kinds of tangled rules, but they don't lift a finger to help those who are crushed under that impossible burden. They're happy to see them fall flat on the floor, unable to rise. They're harsh, graceless taskmasters. Oh, you didn't manage it. Oh, didn't tick all the boxes. Oh, well, get down. Stay down. Get out. Stay out. That's the sort of teachers they are. Ones who load people down and then just abandon them as they collapse. And that is not Jesus. That's not Jesus. We might think also, if they load people down with heavy burdens and cumbersome, difficult, tangled rules, well, how does that work in their own lives? How are they doing it? How do they manage to shoulder all those heavy burdens? And the short answer is they don't. And maybe it looks like they walk the talk, but it's all just a show. It's all just a performance. The truth is, it's one rule for you and another rule for me. And we're no strangers to people like that, are we? You must stay at home. But while you're not looking, we'll have a big party. We'll head off on holiday to our other home. Or I'll just meet my voice coach at the office for a while, shall I? There's plenty of this in our world too, all right? We all must do more to combat climate change as I climb out of my private jet, which I will not be selling, but continuing to travel around in. We all must do more. Let's wring our hands. But actually, it's a bit worse than simple hypocrisy, saying one thing and doing another. Their lives are one big act, and it is a public performance. They are playing to the crowds. Everything they do is done for people to see. Everything they do is done for people to see, not for God to see. What does this mean really matters to them? If everything they do is for people to see, what really matters to them is what people think of them, not what God thinks of them. What really matters to them is where they sit in the pecking order. They want to be sure everyone knows exactly how important they are. No one mistakes them for just ordinary people when they're special people. And what tickles them, what really makes their day is being someone, being known, is making the A-list, getting the party invites. Here's the thing. It's easy to poke fun at Boris or Keir. It's easy to poke fun at these Pharisees, to do them down and call them out for their performance living. But do we not do exactly the same things? Perform for people's praises? Do we not so often want exactly the same thing, wishing we would be noticed, honored, respected, applauded? Aren't we so often more worried about what people think of us than what God thinks of us? I mean, who here has never done a good deed just because somebody else is watching? Pick up the litter, hold the door. Who here has never let what people think drive us more than what God thinks? Gone along with the crowd when we should have stood up and stood out. The truth is that we are mixed up creatures. Our hearts are in a mess. None of us is righteous either. Not one. The heart is deceitful above all things. That's the Bible's take on us as humankind. It's not a positive view. So when we read a passage like this, we mustn't come away from this thinking, Jesus' big point with this sort of teaching, big point with showing us these Pharisees, is showing us they're bad so we can feel good, since we're so much better than them. Oh, I thank you, Lord, that I am not like those Pharisees. Well done, me. I thank you that I do not perform for others to be honored like those Pharisees do. They're hypocrites. Well, so often we are too. And as we read on, we're going to see Jesus isn't just putting down these Pharisees and teachers of the law. He's preparing the ground for what comes next. So we've got the second half of our passage still to think about here. So Jesus turns to his disciples next, and he says to them, no rabbis. Now that's not commanding an end to a certain tour guiding company. It's not no rabbis. This is no rabbis. That's a Jewish term literally meaning my great one. My great one. Often used for teachers. Instead, we're all to be brothers and sisters with only one exalted above, and that is Jesus. No one is to magnify themselves or to allow themselves to be raised over everyone else. Then he says, no honored fathers. And I think it makes sense to read that as a title of respect and honor and authority rather than just a family relationship. Jesus is not trying to destroy the family unit here and say, don't call dad, dad. In that culture, sometimes father was used as a title of honor and respect. You'll see the disciples using that as they speak to some of the Jewish leaders early in the book of Acts. He means no one should be so honored over everyone else. The only one deserving that is God the Father. And then he says, you're not to be called instructors. There's only one instructor, and that's Jesus, the Messiah. That is the promised one, or the chosen one, the anointed one. Now, it's interesting here. Jesus chooses this word instructor. That word is only used here in the entire Bible, in that one sentence. It's a bit of an obscure, a bit of an unusual word, but it's just another way of saying exactly the same thing as rabbi, as teacher. That's what he's getting at with it. So why does Jesus effectively repeat himself? I think he's just anticipating us humans are going to get to work right away on undermining exactly what he has said with our supposed cleverness. We'll keep them to the letter. You said no rabbis. There's no rabbis here. Don't worry, Jesus. You said no fathers here, Jesus. Yet none of them at all. I'm just an instructor. That's what I am. I'm just an instructor. It's a totally different thing. And don't I look fabulous in my flowing robes? I think that's what Jesus is doing. Now, is Jesus setting out a pattern for church here where there is absolutely no structure at all? Where it's a totally flat setup. Everyone's at exactly the same level. Each of our opinions is equally valid. Nobody's ideas or teaching ought to be taken over anyone else's. Nobody has higher authority. Nobody leads or directs. Is Jesus establishing kind of a communist church or something like that? You know, not an iPhone, but a Wii phone. A church which is so democratic that we all have to decide together how everything works. A church of identicals? I don't think that can be getting Jesus right. I can tell you that because he's already begun to set up some among his disciples to have special roles and special authority. Back in chapter 10, Jesus chooses 12 from all of the disciples, and he gives them special authority and a special role. He sends them out. In chapter 16, Jesus tells Peter, you're going to have a special and particular role within the church. As the story of the church unfolds in the book of Acts, there's a special apostolic ministry with the 11, and the one who betrayed has to be replaced so that special role can be filled out. The apostles' teaching holds a special place, a special authority, so that the church is devoted to the apostles' teaching. As the church grows, the apostles turn some of their special responsibility over to 7 more chosen leaders in Acts chapter 6. And then so many of the letters from the early church, which form our Bible, speak about people with different gifts or different roles, right? Romans 12, we sung our way through a bit of that this morning. We sung our way through the whole of it some time ago. Speaks about we each have different gifts and we're to use them. Other letters demonstrate people having different roles within the church. 1 Corinthians 12, Ephesians 4. They call us to respect those within authority in the church. Well, that means there must be someone in authority within the church. There's a call to appoint elders in each church. That's the Bible's word for leader. And the way it's framed is we need to put in order what is out of order by appointing leaders in each church. Titus 1. So I don't think you can really see Jesus saying there is no structure, there are no roles, there is no authority, this is just a totally flat mess of identical heads. If that's not what he's doing, what is he doing? What is he commanding? And I think the answer is he's commanding service, not status. He's commanding service, not status. The greatest among you will be your servant. Now, are there places in God's church where leaders are far more focused on their status than on service? Where this has gone badly wrong? Absolutely. Of course there are. Sadly, that's a big reality back through history. It's a big reality here and around the world as well. A lot of damage has been done by that. But when we're trying to think about how to apply what Jesus has to say, It's all too easy to wring our hands and wag our fingers at them over there and worry about other people's problems. Forget Jesus speaking to us too, speaking to here as well. That should be our first concern. So what does this mean? That means there's a very sharp application for me and for all the other leaders here at Hope City. We are forbidden, absolutely forbidden from exalting ourselves and from allowing ourselves to be exalted. We're forbidden from claiming honor, from seeking honor. So if you ever see or hear or feel any of us are demanding that, Jesus here tells you, say no. Jesus tells us those who exalt themselves will be humbled. So do us a favor by speaking the truth in love. Call us out instead. Let us see ourselves and give us the chance to listen, pay attention, and change. And pray that we would do that, because Christian leading and Christian teaching is service, not status. I've been around Hope City a while. You might notice I try and avoid being called Pastor Matt or Reverend Matt or Minister Matt, which would be a nice alliteration. I try and avoid that. Now, sometimes you can't help it. People have come from a place or a culture where those titles and structures are normal, and they presume that'll carry over here as well. But I'm trying to avoid it. I mean, here's my business card. It says leadership team. That's what it says in my email signature too. When I introduce myself here at church, I try and always say I'm one of the leaders here. And the reason I say that is because I am one of the leaders here. Just one. We're genuinely team-led as a church. Now, what I don't want to do here is I'm not trying to criticize other churches or ways of doing things. It is actually possible to have titles and structures like that and not end up with trouble. And I'm definitely not sharing this so you can say, ooh, you're so good, and lift me up. Wouldn't that be ironic and a mistake? I'm sharing it because you can help me and the other leaders here by not going against this and going along with it. Keeping all these titles and this exaltation stuff far away from us by not putting any of us up on a pedestal, because do you know what that has? That has a magnetism, absolutely, and it has an evil gravity to it as well. I mean, don't think for 1 minute that power, authority, exaltation, and being honored have got no appeal for me. I don't think for 1 minute that could never go to my head. There's nothing in me that's hungry for all that sort of thing. Or the other leaders here too. Of course, it's within me. It's within you. Our sinful nature, what it wants to do is exalt self. It hungers for status, position, and power, not for service. That's my nature. That's your nature too. So what do we do about this? What's the antidote? Well, I think Jesus lays it out for us here. It is to make more of Jesus. Is to make more of God. That's how we make less of ourselves. We make more of Jesus. He's the one that gets exalted at Hope City. He's the one that gets the honor. He's the one we come together to hear and study his words. We come to bow to his authority. And here's the thing. As we think about this, Jesus is the one, the only one who can actually safely be exalted like that. His purity and his righteousness so exceeds ours that this kind of corrupting call has no hold on him. Even as he starts his ministry, maybe you'll remember one of the first things that happens to Jesus is he is out into the wilderness to be tempted by the enemy, and the enemy tempts him with exaltation, with authority, with power, and he has the character to say no. He's the one who instead humbled himself and became an obedient servant, and that's why God exalts him. This is a famous passage from one of the letters in the Bible, Philippians chapter 2, about how Jesus humbles himself and God exalts him. So we want to be a church that focuses on service, not status, where leaders lead humbly and don't demand or accept exaltation, where that's reserved for Jesus and for God. That's definitely front and center in this passage, and I'm not trying to get away from the application that points specifically at us as leaders. But I think there is something more general in today's passage that I want us to take, and it is a really powerful insight into what it really means to be humble, right? Which is the main call of the passage. It calls leaders particularly, teachers particularly, to be humble, but it calls all of us to humble ourselves. And I guess it is important to notice that it is humble yourself, not humble others. The main goal of this passage is not that we spend the rest of the day trying to take other people down a peg or two. It is that we look at ourselves and think about what this has to say to us. And this passage helps us unpack what leading humbly looks like, what teaching humbly looks like, and what living humbly would actually mean. It helps us understand practically what that is. And I think we get this out of looking at what the problem Jesus has with these teachers of the law and the Pharisees. What is the root problem? Everything they do is done for people to see. And why do they want people to see? So they're exalted and honored, right? So they get this title, Rabbi, Great One, my Great One. What's at the center of their life? Who is their top priority? Well, themselves. They're absolutely self-centered. They tie up heavy burdens on other people. They don't care about them at all. When they're crushed, they don't lift a finger to help. They're not about other people at all. They are totally self-centered. It's what people think of them, how people see them, how people treat them. And Jesus knows that's not just a problem for the Pharisees. That's why he warns his disciples away from the same trap, wanting to be the great one, honored, exalted, powerful. Everyone, look at me. We've got the same inward leaning too. We're self-centered by default. Okay, so the problem is we're self-centered. Now, what does humility look like? Imagine in your head, what does humility look like? What does a humble person do? What do they say? What do they think? What words would express humility? First things I came up with, oh, I could never do that. That's a humble expression. I could never be like that. Oh, I'm not really important at all. I think that's how we often frame humility. It's often we imagine it should look like. But humility is not primarily about putting ourselves down, about talking ourselves down, about thinking ourselves down, about thinking less of ourselves. Do you know why I know that? Do you know who scored 10 out of 10 for humility? Jesus. Does Jesus put himself down? Talk himself down? I was trying to think, and I don't think he ever does. Jesus knows who he is and what he can do, and he never claims otherwise. Now, does this perfect humility mean he won't say boo to a goose? And I realized I wrote this, boo to a goose. That's a very British phrase. It means somebody who's timid, somebody who holds back from speaking strongly to others. I actually decided I should just see how this phrase translates into other cultures. And in French, the equivalent term is he has his tongue in his pocket. Like that? But the one I really liked was Japanese. The Japanese equivalent idiom, so I read, was he wears a cat. There you go. So now you know if somebody tells you they are wearing a cat, what's going on. Is Jesus the sort of person who won't say boo to a goose? Is he shy? Is he timid? Is he back? No, not at all. That's not perfect humility either. Jesus, in fact, in perfect humility, is still able to call out these Pharisees, deliver really sharp critique to them. And next week, we'll see he gets sharper still. So, all right, what does it mean to be humble? How is Jesus perfect in humility when it's not thinking less of yourself, talking yourself down, or staying out of other people's business? How come these Pharisees are the exact opposite? Well, here it is. Where the Pharisees are self-centered, Jesus is other-centered. That's the ground zero of humility. That is actually what is underneath it. This has helped me understand so much more what it would actually look like to be and to live humbly. Tim Keller has a great phrase for this. He says, it's not thinking less of yourself. It is thinking of yourself less. Not thinking less of yourself, thinking of yourself less. Do you see how that is not self-centered, but other-centered? Jesus is all about serving others. He spends his life serving others. He gives his life serving others. He wants this church to follow him in this. Now, we already looked at Philippians 2, that passage about Jesus' other-centered, humble service, living among us, dying for us. But we need to see it again, and we need to see and understand for us too. This is what humility actually means. It's what it looks like. Jesus is the epitome of the one who humbles himself and is then exalted. Now, Colin, can I invite you back up? I know I've been a bit long today. I have so much to say, but obviously this is a passage that's spoken quite deeply to me. I hope it's had a chance to speak deeply to you as well. Jesus is calling us to service, not status, and that is a call into humility, a call to other-centered living. And that's exactly how Jesus lives. So what we're going to do now with this song is turn our eyes towards him to see how he lives, how he serves, how he saves, and to hear that call to follow his example of humility. Jesus calls for service and not status. Thanks, Colin.
Right, folks, let's stand. From heaven you came, helpless babe, entered our world, your glory fair, not to be served, but to serve, and give your life that we might live. This is our God, the servant King. He calls us now to follow him, to bring our lives as a daily offering of worship to the servant King. There in the garden of tears, my heavy load he chose to bear. His heart with sorrow was torn, yet not my will but yours, he said. This is our God, the servant King. He calls us now to follow him, to bring our lives as a daily offering of worship to the servant King. Come see his hands and his feet, the scars that speak of sacrifice, hands that flung stars into space, to cruel nails surrender. This is our God, the servant King. He calls us now to follow him, to bring our lives as a daily offering of worship to the servant King. So let us learn how to serve, and in our lives enthrone him, each other's needs to prefer. For it is Christ we're serving. This is our God, the servant King. He calls us now to follow him, to bring our lives as a daily offering of worship to the serving King. Let's have a seat.
Thank you. Keeps ringing in my head. Service, not status. At Hope City, we love to interact with one another. So right now, why not turn to someone nearby and just take a minute to share your reflections on this morning's talk or discuss one of the questions up on the screen. And if you still like to ask questions or vote for the questions to be answered, you can go to Q&R on the app or use the URL on the screen. We'll tackle the top questions in a few minutes. So let's give some seconds for you to still pop in your questions, and we'll be answering very soon. And of course, while it's there, you can just turn to somebody close to you and have wonderful conversations. So let's bring that to a close, ladies, everyone. And I hope you've had a chance for some wonderful conversations. Can we bring it to a close, please? Thank you. I want to believe you've had a wonderful chance for wonderful conversations, and we'll love the conversations to continue after we wrap up our gathering today. So Matt has joined me again, and we'll take a look at questions you've been asking after listening to the message. Yes. And we'll take it from the top of the poll. Welcome back, Matt. Some wonderful questions here. And I recognize long-term self-centeredness in myself. How can I change? The first question.
I think the truth is that this is not an enemy we're going to defeat in this life, that this is a struggle that all of us are going to live with the whole time we walk this earth. So I think that's the first thing to say. You recognize long-term self-centeredness? Well, so do I. And I think the truth is that people around you would recognize the same thing. Like, does that mean that we settle for it and we accept it can change? No. But does that mean that if we fight, we're going to win the battle right away, or even win the battle in this life? I think the answer is probably no. But I think perhaps more useful is to think about, how can I change? Self-centeredness, how can you change? I think the first thing to say is simply through an act of will. Simply through an act of will, you have the power to choose to act differently. You can decide to try and alter your course, and you can seek God's help with that to become more like Jesus. So I think choosing to try again, particularly when you've been defeated, and you're discouraged, you're like, well, there I was, self-centered again. I think it's an act of will to get up and say, no, I'm going to try again. I'm going to be about others. I was thinking also about one of the ancient kind of Christian writers talks about the expulsive power of a new affection, which is a complicated term, but it means you can get rid of wrong things by liking right things more. So I think spending more of our time and our hearts on Jesus and putting our affection, wanting and loving towards Jesus is a good way to drive out that love for ourselves. And then I think there are kind of practical opportunities all around you. Yeah, you can serve at Hope City and join a team and be part of a team, but you don't need to be part of a team to be part of the church family and know and connect with the people around you, see their needs and choose to act to meet them. So how can I change? I think here I'm saying a lot that get up, dust yourself down and try again. Recognize it's going to be a long struggle, but keep fighting. I'm not sure that's a very good answer, though, Bimbo. What would you say? How do you change and try and...
I don't think there's a straight answer to this. But to me, I just feel, why not we instead of I? Most people are so self-centered. I did this, I did that. It's a team. It's an effort, joint effort. So, like Jesus will say, let's go to the other side. He didn't say, I'm going to the other side, you guys join me.
Great. Yeah, try and put plurals in our language more often. We's and us. And even in simple things like, we restated the DNA of Hope City. And one of the things we talked about was blessing those around us. And we put the plural in right there to make it a collaborative thing. Yeah. I don't have a great answer for that. Why don't you talk to one another about it and make a much better answer for one another in a minute? That'd be good.
All right. The next one. Why is it right to have a pastor, but wrong to have a pope?
Well, here, I guess I don't think it's my job or place to speak out against a particular structure. I think we really want to bring this back to service, not status. I think a structure that joins multiple churches together under one central authority is not necessarily a problem. In Acts chapter 15, the church has a question and they go back to the apostles in Jerusalem to get that question answered. So it's not like there's fundamentally a problem in Scripture with there being an authority structure over multiple churches. I think the issue is when we turn these oversight roles into roles of status and exaltation, when people use them as something self-centered rather than living in them in an other-centered way. So I think it can be just as wrong to have a pastor if the pastor's all about making themselves big, standing on the platform and making themselves great. The problem is not the particular title, right? I think that's exactly why Jesus used rabbi and instructor. He's like, don't be weaselly about this. It's not the specific name or word that's the issue. It is the principle that people who exalt themselves are danger for themselves and they're danger for others. And people who seek to serve, like Jesus did, can be entrusted with greater authority, and that can actually be a blessing to the wider church.
Okay, because of time, let me just merge two. Now, I recognize, how do we reconcile Jesus saying to call no one Father with Paul saying to the Corinthians in 1 Corinthians 4:15 that he became their Father in Christ?
Yeah, I was thinking about that. I think that's one of the few examples where you'll see these particular titles actually in use in the New Testament. And if you look at the context in 1 Corinthians 4, which I had to look at and remind myself of, so don't think I just know all these answers. I had to look at it too. Paul is appealing to the church, and he's using Father there as a familial connecting rather than an honorific and authority type thing. Now, he is trying to serve that church rather than exalt himself with a status over it. And so I actually think you probably could use the title Father. I don't think it'd be wise to do what Jesus told you not to do. I would generally try and avoid that. But underneath the specific titles Jesus critiques, He's critiquing a principle that is seeking status rather than serving people. And Paul is not seeking status, he's seeking to serve. He's not abusing his authority, he's trying to appeal through familial bonds to people there. So that's, I think, how I would treat that one. But it definitely does feel like it's skating close to the wind. But the Apostle Paul has the Spirit of God, and I think we're probably best not to critique him.
All right then, and lastly, because of time, how should we act when we're being told to do something the other person doesn't do themselves?
It's not that you can never obey a hypocritical instruction. I guess stay at home, save lives. Just because some people didn't obey that instruction, it wouldn't have made the right response be for all of us to ignore that instruction and carry on. Just because I don't wash my hands, but I tell you to wash your hands for your good, you can still obey good and right instructions from people who do not obey them themselves. There are things to learn. And other commentators looking at this passage would say things like, look, the Pharisees do still teach the heart of the law of Moses, and so you can still follow them in that as they teach you to love God and exalt him. And I think that would be true. I just think that's not the best interpretation of this passage. So how should you act when being told to do something the other person doesn't do? With humility, with wisdom, and with grace. I guess when you feel like you're being told something hypocritically, you should just remember that you also are the hypocrite who tells other people to do things that you do not do. So we should humble ourselves even in that situation and try and walk with wisdom.
The phone example you gave came to mind. Okay, thank you. That's all we have time for today, sadly. But Matt, the take home today, or take away.
Yeah, service not status. Humble yourselves.
Thank you.